I inherited an apartment. Mom said, "Tell your husband we're in debt." 3 hours later, they all showed their true colors. I thought I was driving to sign paperwork for a modest inheritance. I had no idea I was about to watch my husband, my mother-in-law, and her entire family strip away every mask they'd ever worn, all in the span of a single afternoon. And the most devastating part? My own mother had seen it coming for years. She'd left me a note in the entryway of a luxury 3-bedroom condo that I never even knew existed. A note with 7 words that would save everything I had left. Tell your husband and his family you inherited a lot of debt. I didn't understand it at first. I stood there in that bright, sun-filled hallway, the smell of fresh paint and wood polish rising around me, holding a folded piece of paper in my mother's handwriting, and I genuinely thought she must have made a mistake. Maybe she'd written it for someone else. Maybe grief was making me misread simple sentences. My mother had passed away 11 days earlier, quietly, in her sleep, the way she had done everything, without drama, without fanfare, without asking anything of anyone. She had never once in her life been the kind of woman who played games. So why had she written this? 3 hours later, I understood exactly why. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old, and until 11 days before this story truly begins, I would have described my life as good. Not perfect, but genuinely, solidly good. I had a husband named Daniel, whom I had loved since we were both 26 and standing in line at a farmer's market, arguing over the last bunch of heirloom tomatoes. I had a small but warm apartment in the eastern part of the city, a job I cared about as a mid-level project coordinator at an architecture firm, and a mother named Ruth who called me every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, rain or shine, and always asked the same opening question. What made you laugh this week? She believed that laughter was a vital sign. She checked for it the way a doctor checks a pulse. She had been sick for 2 years, though she had hidden the full severity of it from me for most of that time. Not out of cruelty, but out of love. The complicated, sometimes suffocating love of a woman who has weathered a great deal alone and does not want her daughter to carry weight before it's time. My father had left when I was 9. Ruth had raised me in a 2-bedroom apartment on a teacher's salary, and she had done it with such steadiness and warmth that I had not understood, until I was much older, how hard it had actually been. She made poverty feel like coziness. She made scarcity feel like simplicity. She was, in the truest sense, the most resourceful person I have ever known. What I did not know, what she had kept hidden from me, and apparently from almost everyone else, was that Ruth had inherited money from her own mother, my grandmother Vera, who had died when I was in college. Not a small amount of money. A substantial, carefully invested, quietly grown amount of money. And with it, roughly 4 years ago, she had purchased an apartment. A 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom unit on the 7th floor of a building in one of the better neighborhoods of the city, with a south-facing balcony, a parking spot, and a storage unit in the basement. She had paid for it outright. No mortgage, no debt, no co-signers. Just Ruth, sitting across from a notary with a certified check and her reading glasses, signing her name in her precise, old-fashioned cursive. She had never told me about it. She had lived in her own modest rental until the end, visiting the condo periodically, keeping it clean, renting it out for 2 years, and then leaving it empty for the last 18 months of her life. The rental income had gone into a separate account, which I also didn't know about. When her attorney, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Hargrove, called me 5 days after her funeral and asked me to come to his office, I had assumed I was coming to collect a few $1,000s in savings and perhaps her jewelry. What he slid across the desk toward me was a deed. I remember staring at it. I remember the way the afternoon light came through the blinds in horizontal stripes and fell across the paper, and how I kept reading the address over and over, as if the repetition would make it make sense. The attorney explained everything slowly and clearly: the purchase price, the current estimated market value, the status of the title, the keys in the envelope beside the deed. He told me Ruth had updated the documentation 18 months ago, which meant she had made this decision deliberately, at a point when she already knew she was seriously ill. She had chosen to leave it to me. Only me. Not to the estate, not divided among relatives, not encumbered in any way. Just to me. I drove to the building that same afternoon. I didn't call Daniel. I don't know exactly why. Perhaps some instinct I didn't yet have language for. Some low, quiet hum of warning I hadn't consciously registered. I told myself I simply wanted to see it first, alone, before turning it into a shared experience. That felt reasonable. That felt like the kind of thing a person does. The building was nicer than anything I had expected. The lobby had marble floors and a concierge desk, though the desk was unstaffed at that hour. The elevator was clean and quiet. The 7th floor hallway smelled of nothing. That particular neutral nothing of a well-maintained building, neither stale nor artificial. I found the door, fit the key, and stepped inside. The condo was beautiful. That's the only word. It was simply, abundantly beautiful. High ceilings, large windows, afternoon light flooding every room, hardwood floors the color of warm honey. The kitchen had stone countertops and stainless steel appliances, and the master bedroom had a walk-in closet that was larger than the bathroom in my current apartment. The balcony looked out over a park, and you could hear, faintly, the sound of the city below. Not intrusive, just present, like a heartbeat. I walked through every room twice. I stood on the balcony for a long time. I thought about my mother sitting here, looking out at this same view, knowing she would never tell me about it until she was gone. I thought about all the Sunday evening calls, all the "what made you laugh this week?" questions, and how she had carried this enormous secret with such complete, practiced calm. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or heartbroken. I felt both, tangled together, pressing against the inside of my chest. And then I went back to the entryway to get my bag, and I noticed the envelope on the small console table just inside the door. My name in my mother's handwriting. I had missed it on the way in. I opened it there, standing in the entryway with the afternoon light at my back, and read the note inside. Claire, this is yours. Do not put Daniel's name on the deed. Do not tell his family what you have. Tell them, if they ask, that I left you a lot of debt. Let them react. Trust what you see. I love you more than any apartment, any deed, any amount of money. But I love you enough to tell you the truth. Watch carefully, sweetheart. Watch what people do when they think there is nothing to want from you. Mom. I read it 3 times. My throat was very tight. I folded it back along its original creases and stood there in the silent, sunlit entryway of a beautiful apartment I now owned, and I felt the first cold thread of understanding begin to pull. My mother was gone, but she was still, somehow, protecting me. I drove home slowly, the note in my coat pocket, my hand resting on it at every red light. The afternoon was fading into early evening. Daniel would be home by now. He worked as a sales manager for a mid-sized logistics company and kept regular hours, and on Thursdays he usually picked up Thai food on the way back, and we ate on the couch and watched something we both half ignored. It was a ritual I had always loved. It had always felt like evidence of something solid. I pulled into our building's parking lot and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. I thought about the note. I thought about the specific instruction. Tell them I left you a lot of debt. Not just Daniel, them, his family. My mother had said his family, as if she had anticipated that this would not stay a conversation between husband and wife, but would immediately, inevitably, involve a larger circle. She knew something I was still in the process of learning. I went upstairs. Daniel was home. There was no Thai food. Instead, he was standing in the kitchen on the phone, speaking quietly, and he turned when he heard the door and gave me a small smile and held up one finger. I set my bag down and took off my coat and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I couldn't hear what he was saying because he had turned away again, and his voice was low and quick, and he wrapped up the call in under a minute. "Sorry," he said, setting down his phone. "Work." "Late call," I said. "Yeah, one of the regional managers." He opened the fridge and looked inside with the focused blankness of a man looking for something to do with his hands. "How did it go? The lawyer thing?" "Fine," I said. "It was fine. Not much. Some savings, a little jewelry, and apparently some debt she'd been carrying. Credit line she'd taken out." I watched his face as I said it. I was looking for something I couldn't have named, some flicker or shift. But his expression was simply sympathetic, a slight furrowing of the brow, a small nod. "Oh, that's rough. How much?" "A fair amount," I said. "Mr. Hargrove is going to send me the full breakdown. I won't really know until next week." "Well," Daniel said, closing the fridge, "we'll figure it out." He came over and kissed my forehead, and it felt, as it always did, warm and familiar. "You okay?" "I'm okay," I said. That night, lying in the dark beside him while he slept, I replayed the day in my mind. The deed, the apartment, the balcony and the park and the honey-colored floors, my mother's note folded in the pocket of my coat, hanging on the hook by the door, and Daniel's face when I told him about the debt, open, sympathetic, unremarkable. Either my mother was wrong, and I was about to spend the next weeks feeling foolish for running an unnecessary test on my husband, or she was right. I stared at the ceiling and waited to find out. The next morning arrived the way ordinary mornings do when something extraordinary is quietly unfolding beneath the surface, with birdsong and the smell of coffee and the comfortable, unremarkable sounds of a shared life. Daniel showered first, as always. I lay in bed listening to the water run and thought about my mother's handwriting on that note, the particular way she formed her lowercase w, wide and careful, like a small crown. I had been looking at that handwriting my entire life. I knew it better than I knew my own. Watch what people do when they think there is nothing to want from you. I got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window watching the street below come slowly to life. Friday morning. A woman walked a small dog. A delivery van idled in front of the building across the street. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly as it always was. And yet, I felt it. That low, steady hum of something shifting, the way the air changes pressure before a storm that hasn't yet appeared on any forecast. Daniel came into the kitchen already dressed, tie loosened, jacket over his arm. He poured himself coffee, kissed my cheek, and then, with the casual ease of a man asking about the weather, said, "Did you call your Aunt Diane about the estate stuff? She might want to know about the death situation if it's significant." I turned from the window and looked at him. Aunt Diane was my mother's younger sister, and we were not particularly close. There was no logical reason for Daniel to suggest I call her about my mother's estate, especially the morning after I'd mentioned it for the first time. No logical reason except one. He had already spoken to someone who had already begun thinking about the shape of what I'd inherited. "Not yet," I said evenly. "I want to wait until I have the full picture from Mr. Hargrove." "Right, yeah, makes sense," he said, and drank his coffee. He left for work 20 minutes later. I waited until I heard the elevator doors close, then I picked up my phone and called Mr. Hargrove's office and asked a single question. Was the property deed fully and exclusively in my name, and had any other party been contacted about the estate? Mr. Hargrove confirmed that the deed listed only me, and that aside from the notification to me, no other party had been formally contacted. He did mention, with a careful neutrality that I appreciated, that he had received a call the previous afternoon from a man who had identified himself as my husband, asking general questions about the estate of Ruth Caldwell. The previous afternoon. While I was standing on the balcony of an apartment I hadn't yet told Daniel existed. I thanked Mr. Hargrove and sat down slowly on the couch. The apartment was very quiet. The coffee in my mug had gone slightly cool. I thought, he called the lawyer before I even got home, which meant he had known about the appointment before I left, which I had mentioned to him the previous evening, casually, as a minor errand. And he had used that window, while I was across town learning I owned a condo, to start making his own inquiries. My mother had seen this. She had seen this so clearly that she had prepared for it with the precision of someone who has had a long time to think. I needed to understand exactly what was happening, and I needed to do it carefully, without showing my hand. So I did the only thing that made sense. I called my mother's oldest friend, a woman named Patricia, who had known Ruth for over 40 years and who had, at the funeral, pressed both my hands in hers and said, in a low, firm voice, "Your mother told me things. When you're ready, call me." At the time, I had assumed she meant grief things, memory things, the soft archive of a long friendship. Now I was not so sure. Patricia answered on the second ring. When I told her I was ready, the line was quiet for just a moment, and then she said, "Come for lunch today. Come at noon. And Claire, don't tell Daniel where you're going." Patricia lived in a tidy house on a quiet street 20 minutes from the city center. She met me at the door in a linen apron, and the house smelled of soup and old books and faintly of the same rose-scented hand cream my mother had used my entire childhood. Walking into Patricia's kitchen felt like stepping briefly back into a version of the world where my mother was still alive, and I had to stop for a moment in the doorway and simply breathe. We sat at the kitchen table with soup and bread, and Patricia folded her hands and looked at me with the calm, clear eyes of a woman who has decided to tell the truth after a long time of holding it quietly. "How much do you know?" she said. Not a question, really, but an opening. "I know about the apartment," I said. "I know she left me a note. I know Daniel called the lawyer before I came home yesterday." Patricia nodded slowly. "Your mother was worried about Daniel for a long time," she said. Not about him personally. She didn't dislike him. But she was worried about his family, about his mother specifically. His mother, Sandra. Sandra was 61 years old and lived across town in a house she had shared with Daniel's father until his death 6 years ago. She was a small, tidy woman with silver-streaked hair and an expression of permanent, mild concern, the kind of face that made you feel in her presence that you were perpetually one step away from doing something slightly wrong. She had opinions about everything: how I loaded the dishwasher, what kind of curtains we should have in the living room, whether the neighborhood we lived in was really suitable for starting a family. She delivered these opinions with such gentle insistence that refusing them felt like kicking a very small, harmless animal. I had never liked her. I had spent 3 years pretending otherwise. "What did Mom know about Sandra?" I asked. Patricia got up and went to the counter, where a manila folder sat beside the bread box. She brought it back to the table and set it in front of me. "About 8 months ago," she said, sitting back down, "your mother asked me to help her research something. She'd overheard a conversation between Daniel and Sandra at your apartment while she was visiting you and you'd stepped out to run an errand. She didn't hear everything, but she heard enough to know that Sandra was asking Daniel about Ruth's health, about whether Ruth owned any property, and about what would happen to Ruth's assets when she died. Daniel wasn't arguing. He was answering." I opened the folder. Inside were printed pages, property records, a series of handwritten notes in my mother's tidy script, and 2 printed email screenshots. The emails were between Daniel and Sandra. My mother had not obtained them through any extraordinary means. Sandra, apparently, used a shared family email account that she had once asked Daniel to set up on her behalf, and that Daniel had accessed from our home computer, logged in, and never logged out. My mother had been at our apartment, alone, waiting for me to come back from an errand, and had sat down at the computer to look something up, and had seen the inbox open. She had not read the emails then. She had waited, and then she had come back, alone, and she had read them, and then she had printed them, and then she had carried this knowledge inside her, quietly, for months, while she decided what to do. The emails were dated 14 months ago. In the first one, Sandra wrote to Daniel, "I've been asking around. Ruth owns something. I can feel it. She lives too simply. It's deliberate. Find out what it is before she goes. If it's property, we need to know before it gets locked into an estate Claire controls alone. There are ways to protect your interests as her husband. Talk to Robert. Robert was Daniel's older brother who worked in real estate. In the second email, sent 3 days later, Daniel replied, "Talk to Robert. He says if Claire inherits and it goes into a joint marital account, I have a claim. The key is to get her to add me before she gets independent advice. I'll work on it. Mom, please don't push too hard before we know what there is. If Claire gets suspicious, it'll complicate everything." I read both emails twice. My soup had gone cold. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, and a bird called once from somewhere in the garden. And then there was only silence, and the soft sound of Patricia breathing across the table from me. The key is to get her to add me before she gets independent advice. I thought about Daniel saying, 3 years ago when we married, that he believed in keeping finances transparent between partners. I thought about the 3 times in the past year he had gently suggested we consolidate our savings accounts. I thought about the conversation last spring, where he had mentioned, almost in passing, that it might make sense to put both our names on everything, just for simplicity. I thought about how each time I had said, maybe, let me think about it, and how each time he had dropped the subject without pushing, patient, strategic, never showing urgency. I thought about my mother, sitting alone at my kitchen table with this inbox open on the screen, reading these words about her daughter, about her own approaching death treated as a window of opportunity. I thought about her closing the email tab, standing up, going to the window, and standing there for however long it took to put this information somewhere she could carry it without it crushing her. She had carried it for 14 months. She had made a plan. She had bought time by saying nothing, and she had spent that time building the most elegant, precise protection she could manage. A deed in only my name, transferred directly, bypassing every joint claim Daniel might attempt, and a note in the entryway of an apartment he didn't know existed, telling me, in 7 words, exactly how to see him clearly. "She never told me," I said. My voice sounded strange to me, distant, like it was coming from another room. "She didn't want to tell you before she was sure," Patricia said. "And then, when she was sure, she didn't want to spend whatever time she had left turning your marriage into a battlefield. She thought—" Patricia paused, and her voice softened slightly. "She thought it was possible Daniel could still make a different choice. That if nothing materialized, he might simply be someone who'd had a bad conversation with his mother and come back to himself. She wanted to give him that chance. And if he didn't take it? Then she wanted you to see it yourself," Patricia said, "with your own eyes, without her there to influence what you did with it." I closed the folder. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me. I had expected to feel the floor tipping, the world lurching sideways, the physical symptoms of a life cracking open. Instead, I felt something colder and more solid than I'd anticipated, a strange, hard clarity, like stepping outside after a fever finally breaks. My husband had known about my mother's potential estate. He had discussed strategy with his mother. He had planned to position himself for a claim before I could get independent legal advice. And then, yesterday afternoon, while I stood on a balcony my mother had bought with the inheritance from her own mother, he had called the lawyer. I thanked Patricia. I took the folder. She walked me to the door and held my hand for a moment in both of hers, the same way she had at the funeral. "Your mother was a very wise woman," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm just now understanding how wise." I drove back into the city, the folder on the passenger seat, the afternoon sun bright and flat against the windshield. My phone had 2 texts from Daniel. "Dinner tonight?" Thinking Italian, and "How are you doing? Been thinking about you today." And I read them both at a red light and felt something cold and surgical move through me. Not rage, not grief, something more deliberate than either of those things. I thought about what I was going to do next. I thought about the apartment, the deed, the emails, the note in my coat pocket. I thought about Sandra, small, silver-haired Sandra with her gentle opinions and her 14-month-old email about protecting Daniel's interests. and I thought, I need to understand the full shape of this before I move. I need to know everyone who is involved, everything that has been planned, and exactly how far it has gone. Because my mother had not raised me to react. She had raised me to think. That evening, I texted Daniel back. Italian sounds great. And yes, I heard back from Mr. Hargrove today. Looks like the debt might be bigger than I thought. I'm going to need your support getting through this. His reply came in under 60 seconds. Of course, I'm here for you, whatever you need. I set down my phone and looked out the window at the city and thought, I know exactly what I need, and it isn't you. But I wasn't ready to say that yet. There was still more to see. The Italian restaurant Daniel chose was the kind of place we had gone to in the early years of our marriage. Warm lighting, small tables, a menu that never changed and didn't need to. We had a booth near the back, and Daniel ordered a bottle of red wine without asking, which he knew I loved, and he reached across the table and covered my hand with his, and looked at me with an expression of such genuine, practiced warmth that I felt, for a strange half-second, the pull of wanting to believe it. That was the most frightening moment of the entire evening. Not anything he said, just that half-second when I almost forgot what I knew. I didn't forget. I held my glass, and I smiled, and I let him lead the conversation, and I watched. My mother had written, "Watch carefully," and I was watching. Not with the hot, obvious attention of someone who suspects, but with the quiet, peripheral attention of someone who already knows and is simply gathering the last pieces. I've been thinking, Daniel said, about halfway through the main course, setting down his fork with the casual ease of a man who has rehearsed this moment to the point where it no longer looks rehearsed. About the debt situation with your mom's estate. I think we should sit down with someone, a financial advisor, maybe Robert, he knows this stuff, and figure out the smartest way to handle it together, as a team. There it was, Robert. Mentioned as an afterthought, as a helpful resource, as a natural suggestion. Daniel's brother Robert, who had advised him 14 months ago that the key was to get me to add Daniel's name before I got independent advice. That's really thoughtful, I said. I've actually already called Mr. Hargrove to discuss my options. He recommended I work with an estate attorney first, before involving anyone else. Something shifted in Daniel's face. Not dramatically, not a flinch or a flash of anger, just a slight recalibration, a microscopic tightening around the eyes. He picked up his fork again. Sure, yeah, that makes sense. I just meant, I want to support you through this. You don't have to handle it alone. I know, I said. You've always been so supportive. He smiled. I smiled. We finished our dinner. On the drive home, his phone buzzed on the center console. Screen up, which was unusual because Daniel habitually placed his phone face down. I saw the name before he swiped it dark. Mom. He said nothing about it. Neither did I. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I lay in the dark and made a list in my head of what I knew and what I still needed to know. I knew about the emails. I knew Daniel had called the lawyer. I knew Robert had been consulted. I knew Sandra had been asking about my mother's assets for at least 14 months. What I did not yet know was the specific plan, whether there was a concrete legal strategy in place, whether they were simply watching and waiting, or whether something had already been set in motion that I hadn't yet discovered. The next morning, a Saturday, Daniel said he needed to run some errands and would be back by early afternoon. He kissed me at the door and left with a lightness in his step that I recognized now as the lightness of a man who believes he is managing a situation successfully. I watched from the window as he got into his car below. He turned left at the end of the block, away from the grocery store, away from the hardware store, in the direction of the eastern part of the city, in the direction of Sandra's house. I gave him 10 minutes, then I got dressed and drove to the apartment. I had keys. The deed was in my name. I stood in the entryway and took out my mother's note and read it again, standing in the same spot where she had left it for me. and it occurred to me for the first time that she must have stood in this same entryway when she wrote it, or perhaps sat on the floor, the way she sometimes did when she was thinking, with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, writing on whatever paper she had in her bag. She had always written important things by hand. She didn't trust the permanence of digital things. She was right not to. I walked through the apartment slowly, looking at it differently now, not as a gift, not as a symbol of grief, but as a thing to protect. I thought about what it was worth. The attorney had provided a current estimated market value, and it was substantial, more than 3 times what Daniel and I had in combined savings, more than enough to change the entire geometry of a life. I thought about Daniel's email. If it's property, we need to know before it gets locked into an estate Claire controls alone. I thought about the phrase, locked into an estate Claire controls alone, and the particular bitterness of it, the implication that my controlling my own inheritance was a problem to be solved. I sat on the balcony for a while. The park below was busy with Saturday morning activity. Joggers, dog walkers, a children's birthday party being assembled near the central fountain, with folding tables and bright balloons that bobbed and twisted in the mild breeze. I watched it all and felt, beneath the cold clarity of the past 2 days, a deep and aching sadness. Not for the marriage. I was still processing what the marriage was and had been. But for the version of the future I had been carrying without knowing it. The version where Daniel was exactly who I had believed him to be, where our life together was as straightforward as it had appeared on the surface, where I could have called him from the attorney's office that first day and said, "Mom left me something extraordinary. Come see," and meant it with pure joy. That future was gone. It had probably never existed. My phone rang. I looked at the screen, expecting Daniel. It was Robert. I stared at his name for a long moment. Robert had never, in 3 years of marriage, called me directly. We were not unfriendly, but we were not close. He was 12 years older than Daniel, settled and slightly distant, a man who expressed affection primarily through practical advice no one had asked for. There was no reason for him to call me on a Saturday morning, unless something had shifted. I answered. "Claire?" His voice was careful, professionally warm, the voice he probably used with clients. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I wanted to check in, see how you're holding up with everything. Losing your mom it's a hard thing. I just want you to know the family is here for you." The family. He said it with a particular emphasis, the word carrying slightly more weight than it needed to for a simple condolence call. "That's very kind, Robert," I said. "Daniel mentioned the estate situation," he said. "Some debt, from what I understand. I just wanted you to know, if you need guidance, I have a lot of experience navigating property and estate matters. Happy to help you sort out what you're actually dealing with. Sometimes these things are more complicated than they look, and having someone in your corner who knows the system can make a real difference." What you're actually dealing with. He had emphasized it almost imperceptibly, just enough to suggest that perhaps I didn't fully understand my own situation. That perhaps I needed someone more knowledgeable to explain it to me. "I appreciate it," I said. "I'm working with an estate attorney at the moment, but I'll keep that in mind." A pause. Brief. Controlled. "Of course. Just know the offer stands." Another pause, and then, "You're coming to Mom's on Sunday? She's making lunch. She'd love to see you. I think she has some things she wants to talk through with you." There it was. Sandra wanted to see me. Sandra, who had written emails about protecting Daniel's interests and finding out what Ruth owned before it gets locked away, wanted to talk through some things over Sunday lunch. "I'll be there," I said. I hung up and sat for a long time with the phone in my lap and the balloons bobbing below in the park. I thought about Sunday lunch at Sandra's. I thought about what some things she wants to talk through might mean, and what shape the conversation would take, and who else might be there. I thought about what my mother would have done, and then, immediately, I knew that my mother would not have gone in unprepared. My mother would have made sure that by Sunday, she knew everything, so that nothing said at that table could surprise her. I had 1 day. I drove to see Mr. Hargrove that same afternoon. He was not in his office on Saturdays, but I had his personal number from the estate paperwork, and I called and explained, as clearly and calmly as I could, what I had found. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then he said, "Come to the office Monday morning. In the meantime, do not add anyone's name to the deed, do not sign anything, do not consolidate any accounts. If your husband or anyone in his family presents you with a document of any kind, do not sign it until we've spoken." "Is there anything they can actually do?" I asked. "Legally, is there anything they can claim? If the deed is in your name alone and the transfer is clean, which it is, then no, a spouse does not automatically have a claim on separately inherited property, provided you keep it separate. The concern would be if you were to add his name, or if you were to deposit any proceeds into a joint account, or if you were to allow any legal argument that the property had become marital. As long as you do none of those things, you are protected." He paused. "Your mother was very careful, Claire. She protected you well." I thanked him. I sat in the parking lot outside his building for a few minutes, watching people come and go through the glass doors, ordinary Saturday people with ordinary errands, and I felt the shape of my situation clarify around me like a photograph coming slowly into focus. The property was mine. The law was on my side. What remained was Sunday. I drove home and got there before Daniel. I changed my clothes and started making dinner, and when he came through the door an hour later, slightly too casual, slightly too cheerful, I smiled and asked how his errands had gone, and he said fine, just some things to pick up, and I said Robert had called to check on me, and Daniel's eyes moved, just briefly, just a flicker, before he said warmly that Robert was like that, always looking out for people. "I told him I'd be at your mom's on Sunday," I said, stirring something on the stove. "He said she has some things she wants to discuss." "Oh, yeah, she mentioned wanting to see you." Too smooth. The kind of smooth that is the opposite of spontaneous. "Just family stuff. You know how she is." "I do," I said. I turned and smiled at him, and he smiled back, and neither of us was showing the other what we were actually thinking, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary smelling, and somewhere underneath all of it, everything was already coming apart. That night I called Patricia. I told her about Robert's call. I told her about Sunday, and then I asked the question I had been circling all day. Is there anyone else? Anyone else who knew, who was part of this? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother suspected Daniel's cousin Marcus was also involved. He's a notary. She found out that he had been consulted. She didn't know what about exactly, but she found a name on a bill at Daniel's office that she saw when she dropped something off for you once. She wrote it down. It's in the folder." I opened the folder on the kitchen table and found, on the last page, in my mother's handwriting, Marcus Trent, notary. Why? A notary. Consulted in advance. For what? A document? A signature? A power of attorney that hadn't been used yet because the right moment hadn't arrived? I stared at the name for a long time. My mother had assembled all of this, piece by careful piece, over months while she was dying, and she had put it in a folder and left it with her oldest friend to be given to me when I was ready. She had not gone to Daniel. She had not confronted Sandra. She had not done any of the loud, dramatic things that might have felt satisfying in the short term, but would have cost her the advantage. She had simply built a record, made a plan, secured the asset, and trusted me. She had trusted me to be as careful as she was. I closed the folder. I put it back in my bag. I went to the bedroom and lay down beside my sleeping husband and stared at the ceiling and thought about Sunday, about Sandra's dining room, the floral wallpaper, and the good china she brought out for family lunches, the too sweet lemonade she always served, the way she tilted her head when she was making a point to signal that she was being gentle and reasonable and not at all threatening. I thought about what she was going to say to me, and I thought about what I was going to say back. And I thought about Marcus Trent, the notary, and Robert with his helpful expertise, and Daniel lying 2 feet away from me, breathing slowly, dreaming whatever he dreamed. I thought, by Sunday evening, everyone at that table is going to show me exactly who they are, and I was going to be ready. Sunday arrived dressed as an ordinary day. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table going through everything one final time. The deed, the emails, Patricia's folder, Marcus Trent's name in my mother's handwriting on that last page. The night before, I had contacted a family law attorney named Catherine Marsh, recommended by Patricia in 3 words: she doesn't flinch. I had appointments with both her and Mr. Hargrove first thing Monday morning. But first, there was Sunday lunch at Sandra's. I dressed the way I always dressed for Sandra's: navy blouse, dark trousers, unremarkable. I put on my mother's pearl earrings, which Sandra had once admired, with the particular attention of someone cataloging what they wanted, a small, private act of defiance. Daniel was quiet in the car. He checked his phone twice at red lights and put it down both times without responding, the muscle along his jaw tightening each time, as if reminding himself of a script. Sandra opened the door before we reached the path. Lilac blouse, silver hair neatly set, arms open. To me first, always to me first. A choreography I had once found touching and now understood as management. The house smelled of roasting chicken and her powdery floral perfume, which clung to every room she'd passed through. Robert was already at the kitchen table with coffee. He stood and shook my hand, formal, which meant he was here professionally as well as personally. And beside him, pouring juice with studied casualness at the counter, was someone I had not expected: Marcus Trent, Daniel's cousin. 40, slight, precise, a notary. He turned and offered condolences about my mother with the warmth of a man who had met her twice and was sorry about nothing. Lunch proceeded with the careful normalcy of a gathering whose real agenda has been agreed upon in advance. Sandra asked about my job. Robert discussed property developments. Marcus made pleasant conversation. Daniel ate and said almost nothing. What I watched, beneath all of it, was the rhythm of glances between Sandra and Robert, too brief, too controlled to be accidental. Marcus kept his jacket on throughout the meal, which struck me as odd for a relaxed Sunday lunch, unless he had something in the inside pocket he might need to produce quickly. When the plates were cleared and Sandra brought out a lemon cake, "I know you love lemon, darling," she folded her hands on the table and delivered the performance she had clearly been rehearsing. "We're worried about you, Claire. The debt situation, on top of losing your mother, it's too much to navigate alone. Robert has looked into some options, and Marcus is here in case any documents need signing today, so we can just handle everything in a comfortable setting without expensive lawyers dragging it out." She said it with such practiced warmth that I almost felt a distant admiration for the craft of it. Robert produced a document from the leather folder on the table. I hadn't noticed it there, flush against the tablecloth. He laid it in front of me. A consolidation agreement establishing joint management of all assets inherited from Ruth Caldwell's estate, including real property, financial accounts, and any other assets of value. Daniel's name already printed in the appropriate space. Marcus's notary stamp waiting in his breast pocket. They had prepared this before knowing what I had actually inherited, before knowing whether there was anything to claim at all. The document existed on the assumption that my mother had left something substantial, and they had been ready to move the moment grief made me pliant. I set the papers down. I looked around the table. Daniel was looking at the tablecloth. "When was this document prepared?" I asked. "Just this week," Robert said, "and Marcus is here to notarize it today, at a family lunch." I nodded slowly. "Can I be honest with you?" Sandra smiled. "Always. I know about the emails between Daniel and Robert. I know about the conversation 14 months ago about protecting Daniel's interests before the estate could be locked into my name alone. I know about this document being prepared by a notary who was consulted before any of us sat down today." I looked at Sandra directly. "I know you have been planning this for over a year." The room went still. Sandra's folded hands tightened against each other, small, involuntary, the body betraying what the face was holding together. Robert leaned back. Marcus went motionless. Sandra opened her mouth. I held up one hand. I also want you to know that my mother left me a condo, freehold, no mortgage, in my name alone. It is not subject to marital claim. I've spoken to an estate attorney and a family law attorney. I am not signing anything today. I looked at Marcus. You can keep the stamp. Daniel pushed back his chair. The scrape of it against the hardwood was very loud. He walked out of the dining room without a word. I heard the front door open and close. Robert gathered his folder. Marcus stood and buttoned his jacket and followed him out. Sandra and I sat alone at the table. The lemon cake was untouched. The clock ticked. Your mother, she said carefully, was a very interfering woman. My mother, I said standing, was the smartest person I've ever known. She loved me enough to protect me from this table. I picked up my bag. I hope the chicken was worth the drive. I walked out through the hall, past the family is everything doormat, down the path between the window boxes, got in my car, and drove away without looking back. Daniel came home at 9:13 that evening. I was at the kitchen table with tea and my phone, face up, watching the minutes. He stood in the hallway a moment, jacket creased, expression somewhere between shame and exhaustion, then sat across from me. I'm sorry, he said. Tell me what you're sorry for, specifically. He went through it, not telling me, calling the lawyer, letting his mother's plan run. He stopped short of the one that mattered most, so I said it for him. You knew Marcus was coming with documents. You drove me there. The silence that followed was the most honest thing he'd said all evening. I kept telling myself it wasn't that serious, he said, that combining finances made sense, that Mom was just being practical. Daniel, the document would have given you joint claim over a property worth 3 times our savings. Your mother planned it for 14 months. You participated. I paused. Did you marry me because you wanted to, or because you knew my mother might leave me something worth having? I married you because I wanted to, he said quickly. I love you. None of that, but you knew, and you stayed silent, and you told yourself that was different from joining in. He looked away. That was his answer. He was not a bad man. He was something more ordinary and more disappointing than a bad man. He was a weak one, and he had sat at a table and watched his brother put papers in front of me and said nothing. And that nothing had its own weight, its own name, and it sat between us now on the kitchen table alongside the tea I wasn't drinking. I need you to stay at Robert's for a few weeks, I said. Not permanently, not officially. I need space to think clearly. If there's anything worth saving, it'll still be there after. He sat with that. Then he nodded, went to the bedroom, packed a bag, and paused in the kitchen doorway on his way out. I am sorry. I know that's not enough. It's a start, I said, but only that. The door closed. The apartment was very quiet. I called Patricia and told her how it had gone. How do you feel, she asked. Exactly what my mother would have asked. Clear, I said. Tired, but clear. That's the right order, she said. Monday, I met Mr. Hargrove at 9. The deed was protected, the asset clean, my legal position strong. Catherine Marsh at 10 called the prepared document aggressive and transparent, and noted that Marcus's presence with a pre-stamped notary established premeditation, legally a significant distinction from a casual family conversation. When she asked what I wanted, I told her. The marriage addressed honestly, the property formally protected, and what had been attempted placed permanently on record so it could never be quietly denied. That's achievable, she said simply. Between appointments, I drove to the apartment and had the locks changed. Not dramatically, practically, the way my mother would have done it. I stood in the entryway afterward with new keys in my hand and looked at the console table where her envelope had been 11 days ago. I could still see it there, the way you see something that mattered long after it's gone. Watch what people do when they think there is nothing to want from you. She had been right. In 72 hours, everyone had shown me exactly who they were. Not one person at that table had led with grief. Not one had looked at me and seen simply a woman who had lost her mother. They had seen an asset temporarily attached to an uncertain outcome, and they had brought good china and a notary. My mother had known they would. She had built the test herself. I locked the door, dropped the keys in my bag, and walked out into a day that was bright and entirely mine to move through however I chose. Sandra had not yet faced the full weight of what she'd attempted. Robert had walked out of that dining room believing the worst he faced was an awkward family rupture. Marcus Trent had gone home without consequence. That was about to change. I called Meg, my closest friend since university, who had disliked Sandra from their second meeting with an instinct I had once dismissed. She told me, voice tight with old regret, that Sandra had called her 18 months ago, asking questions about my family, about whether Ruth owned anything, framing it as concern for my financial security. "I should have told you," Meg said. "You couldn't have known what it meant." I knew it was strange. "So did I said, "for 2 years. I called it imagining things." We sat with that for a moment, the shared familiar failure of extending benefit of the doubt until it becomes a liability. "What do you need?" Meg said. "A witness, and possibly a very uncomfortable dinner in the near future." "I'll bring wine," she said. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table in the new quiet of the apartment and wrote everything down. Not only for legal purposes, though it would serve that. I wrote it the way my mother wrote things, carefully, in order, because recording is also a form of claiming. This happened. I saw it. I know what it was. Sandra would already have her version of events assembled. Claire, overwhelmed by grief, misreading a family gesture, overreacting. Something to cast herself as the wounded party. She was good at that. She had been doing it for years. She was going to find it considerably harder this time. I had the emails, the folder, the attorney's file note, Catherine's assessment of a document designed to deceive, Meg's account of the phone call 18 months ago, and a mother who had spent the last year of her life building a record specifically so none of this could be quietly undone. Tomorrow, I was going to use every piece of it. Tuesday morning, I woke before my alarm for the first time in years, not with dread, but with a bedrock steadiness I hadn't felt in longer than I could name. I made coffee, sat at the window, and went through the plan. Catherine Marsh had said the most effective approach moved on multiple fronts simultaneously, so that was exactly what I did. The first front was legal. Mr. Hargrove filed a formal notation on the estate record documenting the attempted consolidation and the parties involved. Catherine drafted a cease and desist letter to Sandra, Robert, and Marcus Trent, citing the prepared document as an attempt to deceive a bereaved party into surrendering property rights. It went out Wednesday by registered mail. It didn't threaten immediate litigation. It didn't need to. What it needed to do was make clear that what happened at that lunch was being treated as a legal matter, not a family misunderstanding. It removed the comfortable fiction that this could be walked back with a revised story and a wounded expression. The second front was Daniel. He came to the apartment Friday evening. Not our apartment, mine. I had asked him to come here specifically, and he understood what that meant without my explaining it. He stood in the living room and looked at the high ceilings and the park beyond the balcony and said nothing for a moment. I watched him see, for the first time, what my mother had built and what he had quietly helped plan to take. "She never said a word," he said. "No," I said. "She didn't." We talked for 2 hours. He gave me the full version, his mother raising the subject 18 months ago, Robert outlining the strategy, himself listening without refusing, and telling himself a story in which he was protecting stability rather than engineering a theft. He used the word theft himself. I hadn't expected that. "I knew at some level," he said. "I didn't let myself think it clearly." Why not? Because thinking it clearly would have meant choosing, and I didn't want to choose. I looked at him across the small table and held both truths at once. The man from the farmer's market and the man who had driven me to that lunch. Both were real. That was the part that didn't simplify. "I don't know if the marriage is salvageable," I said, "but if it is, it would require you to tell your mother directly that you know it was wrong. Not for my benefit, because if you can't say it to her, you haven't actually decided anything." He nodded. "I can do that." Whether he would remained to be seen. The third front was Sandra. She called the day after receiving the letter. I was in Catherine's office, phone on speaker, recorder on. Sandra's voice had shed its warmth, still controlled but stripped of the performance. She said the letter was an extreme reaction to a family conversation, that she had only been trying to help, that I was clearly still emotional and not thinking clearly about the consequences of escalating a private matter. I let her finish. "Sandra, you brought a notary to a family lunch with a prepared document designed to give Daniel joint claim over my inherited property. I have the emails. I have the document. I have my attorney's assessment of its intent. I have a witness to a phone call you made to my friend 18 months ago asking about my mother's assets." I kept my voice level. "The letter is not an escalation. It's a boundary. What happens next depends entirely on whether you respect it." Silence. "Whatever happens with my marriage, your access to my finances is over. That is not a discussion. That is done." Another silence. Longer. The sound of a woman recalibrating in real time. She had not anticipated the emails being found. She had not anticipated Patricia. She had not anticipated Ruth, quiet Ruth, sitting at a kitchen table with a printed page, building a record she would never live to use herself. Sandra had underestimated my mother her entire life. "I think we should all take some time," she said finally, her voice very flat and very small. "Agreed," I said. "My attorneys will be in touch." Robert contacted Catherine the following week through his own lawyer, confirming in writing that the consolidation document had been prepared in error and that no further claim would be pursued. Marcus sent nothing, which was its own acknowledgement. The legal front closed cleanly. Everything was on record, permanent, not subject to anyone's softened retelling. Daniel had the conversation with Sandra. He told me in a text, brief, plain, unornamented. I talked to her, said what I needed to say. It didn't go well, but it's said. I read it twice and thought, that's something. Maybe not enough, but something. We began therapies separately. Whether it would lead anywhere, I still didn't know. I had made peace with not knowing yet. 4 months later, on a Sunday morning in early autumn, I woke up in the apartment for the first time. I had moved in the previous week, not as a statement, but because the time had simply come, the way a season changes, not dramatically, just definitively. I had furnished it slowly, choosing things I actually loved. The bedroom had curtains the color of deep water. The kitchen had a small herb pot on the windowsill, basil and thyme, because my mother had always kept herbs on the windowsill, and in 3 years of compromised living, I'd never had the counter space. I made coffee and took it to the balcony. The park below was quiet. A man walked a dog that stopped at every lamppost. The autumn air was clean and sharp and made me feel alert in a way that was close to gratitude for the coffee, the view, the morning that was entirely mine to shape. The marriage had ended. Daniel and I had reached that conclusion the same way we'd reached everything in those months, slowly, honestly, without pretending. There was real grief in it, the kind that doesn't simplify into anger or relief, but just sits there, human and complicated, asking to be acknowledged. I acknowledged it. I didn't rush past it. But I also didn't confuse grief with a reason to stay. He had signed the separation papers in September. As I was leaving the lawyer's office, he said my name, once, and I turned, and he said, "She was right about everything, your mother." "I know," I said. I walked out into the September morning carrying nothing that wasn't mine, free of every plan anyone had made for me without my knowledge, free of the long, quiet architecture of a scheme that had miscalculated one crucial variable, that Ruth Caldwell loved her daughter enough to leave her not just an apartment, but a map. The map had been perfect, every landmark exactly where she said it would be. I sat on the balcony with my coffee and the city below me and thought, I know what made me laugh this week, Mom. This did. This exact morning, this view, this life that is entirely mine. I think that would have been her favorite answer.